Hey folks, welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. This is Unit 7, Meaning of Life. So, what we're going to do today is do our usual, intro to the unit discussion. We're going to do a overview of our issues. We're going to do a quick overview of sort of the classic responses to this, and then I'll let you get on to the actual rest of the material. So, our problem for this unit is probably the deepest and most fundamental question that a human being can ask. And I know that sounds like a bit of hyperbole. In fact, I even started the last unit with this sort of idea, that we're asking and looking at deeper and more fundamental questions than some of the others. But I think this one actually wins the prize for the deepest and most important question a human being can ask. And I talked about the question of the existence of God as being one of those, because it has implications for a lot of different things. It talks about stuff related to knowledge. It can influence our views on ethics. It influences our views on what sort of a life should I lead, what sort of sources of information can I trust. It's got a lot of implications. But this unit's question is deep and fundamental for a different sort of reason. I think this is going to be the deepest and most important question, because answering this question can either provide or take away significance to every other human activity. So even if the answer doesn't directly influence our theories about free will or morality, or what sort of a thing are we, in the way that a lot of our other topics have. Because we've covered a lot of different questions in here. But even though this one doesn't directly influence the answers to all the other things we've talked about, our discussion for this unit is going to involve probably the most uniquely human question. A question that everybody asks at some point, even if it's just privately, or if it's bullshitting over drinks at 3 a.m. in a dorm room. What we're going to focus on this unit is the question of the meaning of life. And I don't mean that like in the super generic, fluffy way, like, oh yeah, we're finally getting to the classic, fluffy, pointless philosophy discussion stuff. And I definitely don't mean we're just going to get into, like, what does life actually mean, like the word life or the definition or anything like that. Instead, what we're going to do over the course of this unit is we're going to talk about and discuss and evaluate in a systematic way possible theories about what the significance or the purpose of human life and activity is. This is the sort of thing that you can ask in a lot of different ways. You can ask things like, why am I here? Why are we here? Why do human beings exist? What's the point of all this? Why was I born? What is my purpose in life? These are the kinds of questions that all really kind of get wrapped up and bundled up into our generic one. What is the meaning of life? And that question, because it can color and it can influence, and it gives significance to, or takes away significance from, everything else that we do, I think that this question wins as the most fundamental, the deepest and most profound question that a human being can ask. And because philosophy is the study of fundamental principles, the field of study of the area of human knowledge that dives into the fundamental issues that no other subject gets to, this is, perhaps more than anything else, a philosophical question, a question that philosophers ought to try and answer. And it's not something that everybody can just take an opinion on. It's not something that we just want to say, oh, well, it's something to think about right before you go to sleep, but don't waste any time on it. But the answer to this question, like with all of our others, really does matter to a certain degree. In fact, this is possibly the only question that really matters in life. Because it doesn't matter, perhaps, what's the best way to make money or something like that. Those questions are useful, but they're not necessarily significant unless you also have an answer to what's the meaning of life. If you don't have some sort of an answer to the question of what's the significance of me doing anything in my life whatsoever, it's going to be hard to look into or give an answer to, well, why should I do any of this sort of stuff? Whatever your particular field of study or interest is. So perhaps more than anything else, this question is deep, fundamental, and very much worth answering. And since no other field touches it, philosophers do. So, we're going to spend the rest of this unit investigating possible answers to this question. But for those of you who very much wonder about this sort of thing, you're unsure of your purpose in life, you don't know what you ought to be doing, you don't know why, in particular, you ought to do anything, Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you direct answers here. Like with all of our other questions, we're going to discuss a wide variety of views and possible answers to our question. So don't expect to walk out of here like enlightened by your guru philosophy instructor or anything like that. You want that sort of thing, find an actual guru or a religion or something. But just because I'm not going to be able to directly give you an answer doesn't mean that I want you to assume that there's not an answer to the question. And I think this is worth bringing up because on this subject, in addition to a couple of the others, like the existence of God or our investigations in ethics, people are often prone to assume that there isn't an answer to these really big, really fundamental questions. People have this bad tendency of saying, oh, well, it's just a matter of opinion whether you think life has significance or not. Well, I don't think that's actually the case, and I don't think that's a rational way to approach these questions. Because philosophical questions, yeah, it's true, it's virtually impossible to give a definitive, beyond reproach proof of some answer over all the others. That sort of thing is very rare, if it ever happens at all. Usually philosophical questions are far more open-ended than that. It's harder to find a definitive answer to any of these topics. But that doesn't mean that there's not a definitive answer to these things. Suppose that you found yourself outside of a totally sealed room. Something that has no doors, no windows, no possible way of penetrating and getting to the inside of the room. So you have no way of knowing the answer to the question, what's in the room? Well, that doesn't mean that there's no answer to the question of what's in the room. It doesn't mean that there's no answer to the possible investigations you could do into it. It just means it's really damn hard to get to any answer. But by considering certain options, by throwing out possibilities and discussing their implications, and whether or not they make sense, you could still learn things about what's in the room. For example, if you study the dimensions of the room, you could find out, well, it's too small to contain an elephant, so I know for a fact an elephant is not in that room, unless it's unusually small or something like that. Or I might say, well, because I know geometry and I know that round squares are impossible, because the definition of round and the definition of square are mutually exclusive. One requires corners, one requires no corners. Then I know that there are no round squares inside that room. So you can actually still know things for sure about what's in the room, even if you can't ever definitively and finally answer the question of what's inside of it. And so, perhaps with this question more than any other, I want you to avoid automatically assuming that there is no answer to this question. I think we can still learn some very important things about what the meaning of life is, even if we can't directly and definitively answer the question. So, there's a little note about our topic and a word of warning about how to approach it. So, how are we going to end up approaching this sort of thing? Well, rather than looking to, say, mystic sources of revelation or any of the other things that you might be tempted to for the meaning of life, we're going to be considering the answer to our question by doing the exact sort of thing that I characterize the investigation into a totally sealed room with. We're going to throw out we're going to look at a few different theories of what the meaning of life is, and we're going to consider how plausible those possible answers are. And at its heart, this is philosophy at its most basic and its most powerful. Basically, everything we've done in this class has been another version of this. Everybody who tries to answer one of our philosophical topics, one of our questions, has basically said, okay, here's what I think the answer is, and here's why I think it's a good answer. And at the end of the day, people say, no, that's a crap answer because reasons. Or, yeah, that's a good answer because reasons. So a lot of what we've been doing is looking at people putting out theories and then evaluating, well, how good of a candidate is this for really answering our question? But unlike with a lot of our topics, this particular issue isn't filled with a lot of jargon. There's not a whole lot of technical vocabulary. There's not a whole lot of formal numbered arguments surrounding this sort of thing. So instead, a lot of these lectures aren't going to end up going over vocab or the form of an argument like we've been doing for some of our other lectures and topics. Instead, there's going to be often very short and simple arguments or presentations that have very powerful and influential ideas. And we'll just need to consider whether or not those ideas and theories are actually good answers to our question. So it's going to look a little bit different. It's going to look perhaps a little more simplistic. But you guys have had a lot of practice with doing and evaluating these sorts of things by now. Y'all have been doing philosophy for a few weeks at this point. So rather than walk you through every aspect of every way you can evaluate these things, I'm going to leave a little bit more of that to you. You've been practicing clear thinking for a while. So that's what I'm going to expect of you this go around. It'll be the same sort of thing. It may look a little bit more simple. It may not have the vocab you're used to. But it's going to be essentially the same process we've been using so far. So, in this unit, what are we going to look at? What sort of answers are we going to talk about? Well, there's not going to be a logically mutually exclusive or exhaustive list that we can look at as far as all the possible answers. Like we did with ethics, or say the philosophy of religion unit, where we could say, well, there are basically two answers to the question. You can either say yes or you can say no. When you say, what is the meaning of life? Or when you ask, what is the meaning of life? That's a lot more open-ended. So rather than look at some logically exhaustive list of potential answers, we're going to do a sampling of some of the biggest and most influential views that have happened throughout history. A couple of things that even just intuitively people often gravitate towards when they try and answer this question. And I've picked out these because I think they're very intuitive and natural responses. And we can evaluate and compare those to try and keep things a little bit more grounded in reality. So the first couple of answers that we're going to look at as a pair come from ancient Greece, and that's Epicureanism and Stoicism. And both of these views argue that the general idea, the general answer to the question, what's the meaning of life? Well, they are going to say, well, the meaning of life, the purpose of life, is to live well. And they're just going to differ on what living well actually means. The Epicureans, following a guy named Epicurus, will argue that in general we should pursue moderate pleasure in life, and avoid pain, not suffer, and not fear death. Stoics, pursuing the idea of Stoicism, which is in fact the namesake for the quality being stoic, just not nearly so exaggerated. The Stoics are going to argue that living well is going to constitute things like having a better understanding of those things that are up to us and those that are not up to us. And in order to live well, you need to understand which are which, and then live according to reason and virtue, and just live an excellent life in that way. And although both of these are ancient Greek theories, when we actually get to the kinds of answers they offer, I almost guarantee they're going to seem kind of familiar to you. Like I said, I tried to pick out some of these answers because they're natural and intuitive responses to this kind of question. We're also going to look at a couple of other views. Fellow Julian Braghini will discuss what you can call a teleological theory, a theory that's focused on goals and purpose, saying that the meaning of life can be derived in some way from the kinds of goals and accomplishments that we seek to do. Now, Braghini is not going to immediately endorse this sort of view. He's going to more discuss it and try and refine it into a better sort of picture, because he thinks that just the basic idea that your goals give meaning to life, he thinks there are actually some issues with that. And I think the discussion is going to be a fruitful and an interesting one. Louis Pojman, who we've looked at previously, will try and give us a religious view of what the meaning of life is, saying that whatever your religion is, your religion can provide a source of meaning to you because of the answers and the sorts of things that it recommends. And again, both of these should seem rather intuitive and natural to you. In fact, I guarantee if any of you are religious, if you consider the question much at all, you might default to a religious view. Similarly, if you're a particularly goal-oriented person, your goals may be what give you a reason to keep on living and keep on doing things. The rest of you, though, who haven't moved towards one of these other intuitive views, you might end up finding Albert Camus' view, the one we'll close the unit with, to be a lot more familiar. And Camus argues for an absurdist position. He's going to argue that life has no intrinsic meaning and is fundamentally absurd. And while that may seem familiar in the sense of people like just saying, well, there's no point to any of this, like the universe is a cold and meaningless place, just random, chaotic, and crazy, Camus got still a little bit of a secret up his sleeve as well, because he doesn't just embrace nihilism and say that nothing matters whatsoever, forever, just despair and be upset about it. He's got a little bit of a position that I think can still answer, to some extent, where can we find meaning in life? So, that's the overview, basically, of our question and the possible responses to it that we're going to be looking over. So, go ahead and do your readings, take a look at the next unit, and happy thinking.